It's an honor to be here, I must say. I love being here. I was here a year and a half ago. I just want to make a quick mention. The person who brought me here back then was Mariana Flynn. I think you all know her. Mariana is not well right now, and I think we're all giving her our best thoughts and prayers. I hope she sees this and knows that we're sending her our love. Mariana was touched me deeply personally when I was here a year and a half ago, and I know we're all thinking of her. I'm also glad that Moira McGee is here. Moira is one of your leading lights. She's a gem of a researcher, and thank you for your recent book, Moira. My wife, Tracy, if you just stand up, please, Tracy. This is a lady I married a week ago in Uluru. Thank you. We have a great time. We have a great life. And Tracy does really run our new website, Richard Dolan Members, where Jamie was mentioning. And on that note, one of the members, Janine, just said hello to me. Hello, Janine. Thank you for being here. One of our members is here in Sydney. Maybe there are others. I don't know. That's kept us very busy, and so thank you for that support. So a couple of other things before I jump into this subject of false flags. So I initially came here, I was going to do a talk on ancient aliens. I'm not doing a talk on ancient aliens. I'm just going to tell you this right now. I've decided I don't want to do that. I have something better for you in the second half. I will just say, trust me. So that will be a lecture on what I call the cost of secrecy and forms of societal control, from financial to mind control. And it's a very well thought out lecture at this point. Much stronger than anything I could offer you on Ancient Aliens. You can always turn on History Channel and watch Ancient Aliens, and they'll have better visuals than I can give you anyway. So I think that you'll be glad that we're doing it the way that we are. And plus, these two lectures that I'm giving you are really good bookends for each other. So what this will do is, I got into the false flag subject. How did I do that? People wonder. Some people said, well, you write about UFOs. Why are you going into false flags? And my answer is, well, because before I researched UFOs, I've always, first and foremost, been a student of global geopolitics. That's always been my number one interest. So it's not like it ever walked away, or I ever walked away from it. I never did. When I studied the UFO phenomenon, it's always primarily, not exclusively, from a political point of view. How does the cover-up work? And there's much more to the UFO subject, obviously, but that's been my entry point. So when you get into the cover-up, as I've said a couple of times, I'll never forget my first year getting into the UFO subject, about 25 years ago now. And I remember literally laying in my bed, staring at the ceiling at night, trying to figure out all of these little if-then statements. So if UFOs are real, after all, then what does this mean about, A, B, C, D, and E, about what I thought our history really was? And so it was a process of trying to reintegrate or integrate this new knowledge, this new big knowledge, in with everything I thought I knew. And then you go through your life realizing all of these things that we think we know, do we really know them? And one of those things that kind of came to my attention was false flags. Because it came to my attention that, yes, UFOs were and are being covered up. I'll have a lot more to say about that in the following lecture. But what else is being covered up? Well, a lot. And why? So I want to talk about that. I think probably for a lot of us it was 9/11 that, I'm looking for my clicker, by the way. Let me just walk off camera. Here it is. Sorry. I think 9/11 was the wake-up call for probably the majority of us in this room to the phenomenon of false flags. It was the thing that inadvertently radicalized a lot of the world. And what happened on 9/11 was horrible and tragic, and really even a catastrophe for the modern world. But the one upside to it, you could say, is that it woke up a lot of us. So what I've ended up doing, and what I'm currently doing, is sort of a history of the false flag phenomenon. And I'm trying to put together what I think is the first ever analytical history of false flags. Like, what are they? Why do they exist? Why are they a genuine thing in our world? And maybe how can we identify them They are an ever-mutating virus, but there are ways of understanding them. The one thing that I'll say, when I first started researching false flags, if you go on the web, you'll find a lot of sites that will say things like false flags are an ancient practice. I was willing to accept that at first until I started looking into it, and then I realized, no, it's actually not an ancient practice. There's all kinds of horrible people in the past, like Caligula and Genghis Khan and all of these other psychopaths and murderers. No shortage of that. No shortage of backstabbing and treachery and lies. That's human history. But there is a shortage of false flags. This is an artist's image of the Trojan horse, you know. And the reason I'm using this here, this is a false flag, we're told, when Greek soldiers inside the city of Troy were brought in and at night then came out and ransacked and destroyed the city. The reason I'm having is this is a myth. You know, the Trojan horse appears in the Homeric stories. There's no historical evidence that it actually happened. And the reason is that there are so few examples of genuine ancient false flags. There are a couple, actually. I was just reading a history of the Third Crusade with Richard Lionheart, and I believe he did instigate a false flag in which he, like many ancient rulers, did a mass massacre, in this case of about 5,000 Muslim prisoners, just killed them, based on the rumor that the Muslims had murdered, massacred a bunch of Christian prisoners, which at least at that moment had not happened. So now, was that a false flag? You can quibble. There are all kinds of lies and justifications that are used throughout ancient history. But a false flag in the way that we understand it is a distinctly modern thing. It's a modern form of control. And I'm not going to go into a lot of this history why, but I'll just explain to you. Really, one of the big reasons is the First World War, I think, is actually the foundation why we have false flags today. And what I mean by that is that war was a true meat grinder of human flesh to an extent that no one expected. No one going into that war expected what would happen. Millions and millions of young men just mowed down before machine gun fire. And it traumatized world culture, European culture particularly, so much that out of that war came a very widespread idea that war was immoral. It's not that people didn't think that before, but they really thought it very strongly in the aftermath of that war, with the idea that wars must never be allowed to happen again. And as a result, they founded the League of Nations, the forerunner of the United Nations. And international law became a very important concept as a result of the First World War. So what all of that meant was wars did no longer had the kind of bland justification that they had had in previous times. And what that meant was that hierarchies are always interested in self-aggrandizement, in expansion and aggression. That never stops. So now they needed new pretexts, new excuses to start wars. And that's why one important reason why false flags started to become much more important. Another reason is you've got every new government system that comes online now is supposed to be democratic. It's like, none of them are really democratic, but they all act like they're democratic, and they all have the words democracy in them. And so we're actually now used to more and more just lying to ourselves about what we are and what we do. Another reason false flags are becoming have become a bigger thing is major media. It's now possible to get a message out efficiently to large numbers of people with ever increasing ways, methods of sophistication. In the 20th century in the US, we had someone named Edward Bernays, who was a nephew of Sigmund Freud and really the inventor, the creator of the modern public relations system. Bernays wasn't alone in helping governments to sort of fine-tune their message to the public in very manipulative ways indeed. So all of these things happen. And then, of course, with governments and the militarization that followed World War I, you start getting really sophisticated covert op teams in the aftermath of that. And that just really takes off after World War II. So basically, hierarchies remain. They're still aggressive. They still want to control. But all of that aggression needs to be hidden more and more, masked. And that's what it's all about. We really start getting false flags after World War I. There are a few that are really good cases prior. We can talk about the sinking of the USS Maine, leading to the Spanish-American War, and a few other events, even of the 19th century, are good candidates. Heck, there was a definite near virtual false flag in 1788 by Sweden against Russia. Sweden, who knew? But yes, the Swedes wanted to provoke a war and got some of their soldiers dressed in uniforms of Russian Cossacks and pretended to engage in a war, and it was a pretext for their war, which they lost, by the way. It was a bad idea for Sweden. But anyway, we really get them after the First World War, and with these three nations primarily, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union, the main instigators of false flags in the 1930s. This is the German Reichstag, their parliament, their Congress, in flames in March 1933, a month and a half after Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany. He wasn't dictator yet, he was just Chancellor, like a prime minister. That event here led him on the way, we could say, to the dictatorial powers that he quickly got. It led to what was called the Enabling Act. The Reichstag fire was Germany's 9/11, you could say. It's interesting to point out, to this day, historians will argue over whether or not the Reichstag was a genuine false flag. They can't agree. It's interesting because it just shows how difficult it is sometimes to prove is something a false flag or not. And by the way, I'm going to get into what exactly is a false flag in just a moment, in case you're wondering. But I would say the general consensus seems to be that this was a false flag. That is, that the Nazis organized it and did it, and then blamed it on, in this case, a man named van der Lubbe, a Dutch communist who really, by all accounts, wasn't very bright, and took the blame. There's so much one can go into about that whole event. I do believe that this was an event organized by people like Hermann Goering and other Nazis as a way to give a pretext to clamp down and create the dictatorship. Of course, the most famous German false flag of the 30s was probably the invasion of Poland in 1939, and that's proven. There's no arguing about this. They had a number of their soldiers dressed up in Polish military uniforms and engage in aggressions against German villages on the border in August of 1939, just needing a pretext to invade Poland. And it's not even to do these false flags that you need to have the whole world believe you. That's not really the point. They don't have to be that good. They just have to convince the target population, in this case, their own population, to justify their war. That's all. In the case of the Japanese false flag of 1931 in particular, in Manchuria, there's such a sloppy job of a false flag by the standards of today, like they would never have gotten away with it. They just blew up a piece of railroad track that belonged to Japan in Manchuria, blamed it on the Chinese. It was like a nothing event, but they blew it up into this huge thing and used that to justify major incursion into Manchuria. The Soviet Union had several, domestic and international. You know, when Joseph Stalin did his awful, infamous show trials of the 1930s, where he liquidated any and all opposition to his rule that still existed, it was based on an event that some have compared in importance to the Kennedy assassination, and that is the assassination of Sergei Kirov, who was a Soviet general, and really the last potential rival to Stalin in prestige and power. Kirov basically didn't think that all of this land collectivization and starvation that was happening to people, he thought, we don't really have to do this. Dear Stalin, we actually can go easy on these people. And Stalin was like, oh no, you didn't just say that, did you? And, but Kirov was powerful and influential, and so Stalin just had him murdered and blamed it on, you know, enemies of the state, gave Kirov a hero's funeral, and then just used that to liquidate the entire opposition that existed. The Soviet Union also did a false flag against Finland in 1940, bombed their own village on their side of Finland, blamed it on the Finns, and started their war with them. Pearl Harbor, which I could mention here, has been, oh yeah, we're kind of going on and off like disco lights. No, it's great. It's great. I was just feeling the groove, and it was good. It was good. That's right. People ask about Pearl Harbor and is that a false flag? And I would say technically no. I mean, the Japanese did bomb the U.S. fleet there. On the other hand, there's a great argument, I think a true argument, particular by a historian named Robert Stinnett, that the United States totally had cracked the Japanese code by then and knew exactly what was going to happen and allowed that event to happen for their own political reasons. I think this is true. And you know, people can justify it. They can say, well, the U.S. Needed to get into the war. American public opinion was dead set against entering the war. Totally true. At least 75% of the American public did not want to enter World War II. And you could justify it, but I would just say this. Ask any American in 1941 if they would have known the truth about what happened at Pearl Harbor, how they would react. And they would have all done a mass raid on the White House, I think, and had a lot to say about it. So it was definitely a bit of deception in that regard. But it's really, oh yeah, here's one thing I want to point out about Germany, Japan, Soviet Union in the 30s. Something to keep in mind about all false flags. Those are all nations that had state control over the media. And it's very important to be able to have that if you're going to do a false flag against particularly your own population. If you're going to do a false flag against the world, i.e. the United States, which is the king of false flags, then you have to have control to a large extent over global media, right? And so I'll get into that in a minute. Also, these nations all had a very sophisticated military intelligence community, at least for their era, very sophisticated. So since 1945, since the end of World War II, it's really America's game. There is a silver medal and a bronze medal in false flag Olympics. The U.S. gets the gold, of course. I would say Israel gets the silver and UK, Britain gets the bronze. If I had to make a judgment, they're involved. All, particularly Western allied nations, don't do them. I think Australia's been involved. Certainly I think Canada's been involved. But really they only do it, in my opinion, because they're allowed to by the U.S. This is my opinion. I'll try to explain that as we move along. In America's case, America perceives, its elite, I should say, perceives a need for false flags, a need for rigging foreign elections, and a need to create fake revolutions. I'll have a lot to say about that. This is a spectrum that I've sort of thought of when I was thinking of false flags. So there's what I call a propaganda spectrum. There's different ways that societies control us, mind control us. And some are sort of benign, and some are not so benign. So in the States, I don't know how it is in Australia, but if you're a child in elementary school, they'll sometimes have you do the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. You put your hand over your heart. And that's a form of what we might call cultural conditioning or implementation of cultural values. And again, it's not a wrong thing. It's not a bad thing. Every society has its own need to create a kind of cultural consensus. But what I would say about this type of activity is that it creates a state of mind that inclines one, more often than not, toward a kind of conformity, toward a kind of going along with the flow. So it makes it easier for the following steps to follow. So then there's next what I call cultural distractions. So think People magazine or Kim Kardashian or Dancing with the Stars or the local football game. These are distractions, right? So think of it, when you have this many people in the world seeking to own every single thing that is worth owning, and that of course is our world today. You have the top 1% of the 1% basically owning it all. So that's what's called theft. That's called robbery against us. And so when that's happening, it's not like they want you to say, oh, look what we're doing to you. We're taking all of your money and from your children and your grandchildren for the rest of all time. No, they're never going to say that. So they'll have you look at, Kim Kardashian and her glass of champagne springing out of her, whatever that was, or the football game, or whatever nonsensical scandal is thrust in front of you for you to pay attention to. They're all distractions. And they're there for a reason. And people think, well, that's ridiculous. That's tinfoil hat conspiracy. I'm just like, are you kidding me? So all of the media are owned by 6 corporations. You all know this. You don't need me to tell you that. They own 95% of anything that most people see, read, or hear in the course of a day. It's just a couple of corporations. They own it all. They're very smart. They know about market segmentation, so they know how to appeal to the young, bearded hipsters or the older set or whatever. They know how to hit you, they know how to get you, but they're all owned by the same group. So those are distractions. Now, there are those of us who like to pretend that we're informed. If we have jobs and we have a good salary, we want to act like, we want to have some self-respect and act like we know what's going on in the world. And that's when we get CNN and whatever you have here in Australia, the equivalent. It's same rubbish in, rubbish out, right? So they, news media control filled with censorship, spin, and lies. Lies are very underrated, I've discovered. Lies are really the foundation for how it all happens. But also, censorship, creating reality by omission, I guess I should say, is really what our world is more and more about. I have much more to say about that, but I don't think you need me to say it, and I want to move on to more powerful game, as it were. So I want to talk about covert ops, color revolution, and regime change now. Oh yeah, and I just have a little shout out here for shock doctrine opportunism. You may be looking at thinking, what is he talking about? So there's a book by an author named Naomi Klein called The Shock Doctrine. It's a very good book. And she argues that the United States rules by shock and awe. So basically when a catastrophe happens, that's when the new plans are rolled out. Like they're ready for catastrophes, and they roll out when you're in a state of trauma. One example she used was Hurricane Katrina in the United States, and it was a horrible event. And the corporate agenda to take over and really reshape society in the aftermath. And she uses 9/11 as an example. She doesn't discuss 9/11 as a false flag. I will. But shock doctrine, I think there's something to it. So not every single horrible thing that happens in this world is necessarily explicitly planned. Sometimes things happen, and when they do, plans are rolled out. And then false flags. I'm going to get to all of this. So I want to talk about covert ops and what is now being known as hybrid warfare. Old-fashioned warfare like World War II, World War I, guys in trenches shooting each other. Of course, warfare is now a full-spectrum type of operation. It's not just guys with guns shooting at you. It's cyber war. It's propaganda. It's economic warfare. It's all of these other things that are involved. So in terms of military doctrine, it's all, and then proxy wars. Have people who are not officially working for you, but actually are working for you, fighting. That's proxy war. That's really a major thing of our world today. So covert ops, can include all kinds of things, whether regime change or provocations. In other words, if you're having a protest against the government and some guy with a mask starts getting violent and the police come and clamp down with tear gas or whatever, a lot of times those provocateurs are government agents. You may not know this. You may know this. And it's happened in it's happened in the US, it's happened in the UK, it's happened in Canada. It's probably happened in Australia. Not as familiar with the Australian situation just yet, but I'm sure it's because it's standard operating procedure. You go in to discredit an organization. And false flags. So in the US, there's something known as psyops, military psychological operations. It's now called military information support. They've got to be vaguer and more vague with these names. They just don't want to let you know what they're doing. So it's no longer psyops, it's information support operations. Just like miso soup, but much less appealing. I like miso soup. I don't like this type of miso. So the idea of what they're doing is just psychological operations, is to selectively convey, I love that phrase, information to influence minds, motions, and objective reasoning of targets. This is a military playbook. This is in the US. It's in the US Army Psychological Operations Manual, which, by the way, they took straight out of CIA, a CIA manual from the 1950s, so it never changes. So there's white psyops, gray psyops, and black psyops. I'm just going to mention them real quickly. So white psyops, pretty straightforward. I should have put Trump in here now. But anyway, basically a white psyop is anything that's openly acknowledged, in this case by the US government. So I'm just speaking for the US here. Statements that are like an official statement from the White House. That's considered a white psychological operation. The whole point is to influence the world. So when the President of the United States says something, in theory, the US wants that to be influential to other people in the world. That's called a white psyop. You kind of know more or less where it's coming from. Not really a big deal. Every government, every organization, every corporation does this. Gray psyops are a lot more interesting. So gray psyop, in the US we had something known as Operation Mockingbird. That's a classic gray psyop. So what that meant was, in fact, I'll just tell you what Mockingbird was, because I believe every single person in the world needs to know what Operation Mockingbird was. And certainly in the US, and no one knows what it is. Mockingbird was a Cold War operation, officially acknowledged, in which the CIA paid hundreds of US journalists, covertly. Country didn't know. You know, so you're in your country reading the New York Times thinking, oh, well, this is the news. They're just reporting to me. No, it's not just the news. That journalist is being paid secretly by the CIA to report to you. How objective is that? Well, that's just pure propaganda. And that went on for years and decades. And it still goes on, just under a different name now. But Mockingbird, so in other words, it's the US government or the Australian government or any other government working through what's supposed to be an independent media, but it's not independent. It's covertly got relationships. But it's a lot more effective, right? It would be like if a public speaker has a bunch of really nice questions, softball questions pitched out there saying, wow, you're so wonderful. If I had paid informants in the audience, that would be my gray psyop. It's the exact same thing. Well, this goes on all the time with governments. That's called gray psyops, and it's a major part of our world. And then there's black psyops, and this is where things get even more interesting still. And again, I'm talking right out of the US Army's Psychological Operations Manual. If you're ever at a cocktail party arguing about false flags, you can just say, hey, look, it's in the playbook of the US Army, and it is. Black psyops, according to the United States Army, are an activity emanating from the US government, which appears to emanate from a source usually hostile in nature. Very straightforward, actually. The connection to the US government would be hidden, and the US government would deny responsibility. That, my friends, is a false flag. It's right in the US Army Psychological Operation Manual. They go on to say, very interesting, that black psyops are not a function of the US military. No, they're a function of the US intelligence community. That is CIA and military intelligence, because it's too classified. It's too sensitive. Yeah, hell yes, it's sensitive. I mean, if you're doing something and blaming it on another party, that's quite sensitive indeed. And so therefore, it has to be sanctioned by higher authorities and carried out by CIA or another element of the intelligence community. So that's false flags. They are an official policy of the US military. Guaranteed they're an official policy of other militaries as well. Talk a little bit about domestic versus international false flags, because they're both important. So there are false flags that happen domestically. There are false flags that happen internationally. As I'm arguing, international false flags are most of the time going to be done by the United States. Not always, but usually. Domestic false flags can be done pretty much by, well, many countries against their own population. But doing them internationally, that's like you need the Rolls Royce of tools for that. You need international control over the media if you're going to do an international false flag. I'm just going to do a couple of interesting US international false flags for you right now. Just talk about them, give you a little bit of context as to how this whole thing operates, and also how the phenomenon evolved. False flags do evolve. I called them a mutating virus earlier. They really are, because people become more sophisticated. Therefore, the false flags have to become more sophisticated as well. In 1948, right after the Second World War, if you remember your history, the Soviet Union, which no longer exists, but that was the Russians basically, controlled what we now have as Eastern Europe, and the western part of Europe was under the influence, control of America. And Italy was in the western camp, but Italy had elections, and there was a great fear in 1948 that the Italian election would move toward the left, socialists or even communists. And so the CIA sprang into action in that election and spent $1 million, which you think, that's nothing. But in 1948, that was a lot of money. And particularly in the Italian election, it had a tremendous amount of influence. And so what ended up happening is the CIA organized a massive letter-writing campaign, flooded the airwaves, published forged letters, that was a big part of what they did, and just bribed politicians to make sure that the right-center government won the election, which they did. Out of that, or at the same time, came something known as Operation Gladio. I'm going to talk about Gladio in just a moment, but I want you not to forget that one. A couple of years later, this is the Iranian situation, Operation Ajax, a more famous false flag and one that people really do need to understand. Iran, back in the turn of the 20th century, was really under the control of the company that became British Petroleum. So they had a lot of oil. And the UK was siphoning that out at a very, very nice profit indeed. After World War II, Iran, like many developing nations, had a very strong attachment to socialist ideas and to nationalist ideas. Back then, socialism and nationalism were very much of a piece for many, many nations, and that included Iran. And so one of the things they did is the Iranian parliament wanted to audit the British Petroleum to just look at their financial records. And the Brits were like, enough of that. We're not going to let you look at anything. So eventually, they ended up nationalizing the British oil interests in Iran, a very major thing indeed. Well, the US and UK were like, no, that's not going to stick at all. So the CIA and MI6 sprang into action against the president, Mohammad Mossadegh. And so basically what they did is they bust in thugs, they bribed, they bombed buildings, killed people, blamed it on pro-government operatives, blamed it on communists. So they were killing people and blaming it on the other side. Bust in the most violent thugs and demonstrators from other places to have these demonstrations, and it succeeded. You know, the people who came into the Iranian government, along with the Shah, were some of them were hardcore Nazi collaborators from back in the war, and bribed millions and millions of dollars. I mean, it was just an incredibly corrupt thing. But of course, what they did is they handed the petroleum industry back over to the West. This time, the Americans got in on the action, so they were happy as well. That's Operation Ajax. The next year in Guatemala, another false flag coup. This one actually even more egregious than Iran, if possible. Guatemala, same story as Iran. Again, all these countries really had the same story. They were dominated by Western corporations. In Guatemala's case, all the good land was owned by the company United Fruit. And the Guatemalan people were in poverty and misery. So what was the issue? Land reform. In the late 1940s, a socialistic government comes into power. They start doing land reform. And under a guy named Arbenz, goes even further. Eisenhower is president now, and he's not happy about this. Allen Dulles, CIA director, essentially says, "Bap, bap, not a word, chief. We got this." And they go into Guatemala. And this was a good one. They start planting Soviet weapons in the area, leading to all these fake discoveries. The Russians are coming into Guatemala. The international press, by the way, was so utterly compliant because what the CIA did is they planted fake stories in the international media. This is all part of Mockingbird. Plant fake stories in the foreign media. One story that United Fruit put out that dutifully carried back by American media was that there were mass bodies buried by the Guatemalan government. Not true. But they get that out there. The public gets worked up, starts waving their hands around and thinking, we need to act against the communist menace. This is the ragtag Guatemalan army that the U.S. put together. They're not really too frightening looking, but here's the thing. The Guatemalan military knew the U.S. was behind these guys, and they all panicked. And within a couple of weeks, the coup that was organized by the U.S. was totally successful. But basically, the U.S. set up all these fake radio stations, planted hundreds of articles in the foreign press, and on and on. So no one knew about this. There's the handsome visage of J. Edgar Hoover of the United States. Hoover ran the FBI for many years. I'm sure many of you know who he was. Hoover was, if Hoover had been in Germany in the 30s, he would have been like a Heinrich Himmler type of a guy. I firmly believe it. He was that type of a thinker, that type of a person. But he was in the U.S., so he didn't have quite the leeway. But he had a lot. He was America's spy master. He himself, almost certainly victim of blackmail by the mafia. That's another story. But Hoover, in the 1950s, instituted the program known as COINTELPRO. It's important to know because it's a model for how domestic false flags operate today. So COINTELPRO stands for Counterintelligence Program. Hoover, like many people of his generation, a a very strong anti-communist in his ideology, saw the communist menace everywhere. And I'm not even saying that there were no Russian spies in the US, but Hoover really took this to an art form and used, I mean, any civil rights movement, anything along these lines was, in his mind, communist. And so what you would do is if you were starting an organization like the civil rights organization, Students for Democratic Society or the Black Panthers, they were famously infiltrated by FBI agents posing as members who would then incite that organization to violence or create dissension within the organization through certain psychological tactics to destabilize and derail the activity of these organizations. And it was very effective. It worked very well. It destroyed a lot of careers, destroyed a lot of organizations. It goes on to this day. In the US, we have someone named Cass Sunstein, who during the Obama administration famously put out a piece explaining why the US government needed to infiltrate anti-American groups and conspiracy-oriented groups like you guys. You know, Australian version, well, according to Cass Sunstein, basically the current version of COINTELPRO, the idea would be to go in, bring in provocateurs to prevent the organization from moving ahead in an effective way. And you know, once Snowden's revelations came out in 2013, of course, that further provided confirmation of it. GCHQ, Britain's NSA, has had a whole PowerPoint presentation on how to create false flags against individuals, how to create fake victims of non-existent crimes, for example, to destroy your reputation, or how to infiltrate you know, suspicious groups and so forth. Suspicious meaning any groups that question official government narratives. So it goes on to this day, but COINTELPRO is really the modern model for this sort of a thing. US and Israel did a lot of these types of infiltration. Israel did something called the Lavon Affair, which was exposed. It didn't happen. It was 1954. They had a number of Egyptian Jews inside of Egypt to plant bombings. They were going to destroy an American educational center, bomb it, blame it on the Muslim Brotherhood. It's kind of funny since the Muslim Brotherhood was covertly being supported by the US and MI6, but that's a whole other story. But the point was to create dissension in Egypt so that the Brits would not leave the Suez Canal region. The whole thing got exposed and they confessed. Here's back to Gladio. So Gladio was sort of a NATO CIA version of COINTELPRO in Europe during the Cold War. This man's name was Vincenzo Vinciguerra. He was a Gladio operative. So what Gladio would do, the idea, Gladio was simply the Italian name for what was European-wide. After World War II, the initial fear among the Americans was the Russian tanks are going to roll over Western Europe. And what would happen if they did that? Well, we would need a resistance, just like the French had or just like the Yugoslavs had during World War II. You know, fighting on the ground, making it difficult for those Russians. Well, the Russian tanks never did roll over Western Europe, but the operatives were there. They were trained in all kinds of covert ops, including bombings and other types of guerrilla warfare. And they weren't just sitting around on their hands waiting for things to happen. They were making things happen. So in Italy, we know they bombed, for example, the Bologna train station in 1980, killing hundreds of people, blaming it on communists. And there were many other events that these individuals did, killing, who knows how many people were actual victims of Gladio massacres, but a lot. And this man was, Gladio in Italy was exposed around 1990, and this man ended up serving a life sentence. And he just said, look, the whole point of Gladio was to force these people, in this case the Italian public, to turn to the state to ask for greater security. Great idea. It's a concept that never goes away. You don't have to read this whole thing. If you've got a camera, you want to take a picture of it, go ahead. I think this will be on YouTube, so you can watch it there too. I just have a list. This is a lot too much to go through. These are just American regime change activities in the 50s and 60s, and some of them are pretty interesting and you probably don't know about. Like in Laos during the 50s into the 70s, the CIA carried about basically one coup per year in that country, aside from dropping more bombs there than it did in all of World War II. Most of these cases, you're talking Haiti, Cuba, Congo, Ecuador, Dominican Republic a few times, Ecuador again, Vietnam, Brazil. These are all CIA orchestrated military coups. And I don't really need to go into the details of these, But I just want to impress upon you that this was the old version of how the U.S. would do regime change. There's a new version now, and that change starts to take place during the 1980s. I do want to draw attention to Northwoods, Mongoose, and Tonkin. So, sorry. So Northwoods, people who think 9/11 is crazy talk, I would just point out that Operation Northwoods was a genuine plan that landed on the desk of John F. Kennedy in 1962. What was Northwoods about? Well, it was a plan to take out the Castro government in Cuba, which was a new communist government there. And they were going to do it by, had a couple of different scenarios that they were going to implement. One was fake hijackings of American airliners by Cubans, except that they weren't going to really be by Cubans. It was just, they were going to say it was by Cubans. Killing certain American innocent bystanders, bystanders blaming it on Cubans. So there were going to be dead people involved in this, and it was all going to be blamed on Cuba. Kennedy looks at it and he says, no, we're not going to do this right now. The guy who came up with it was named Lemnitz, and he just was kind of crazy, but really thought that this is all in the name of, the greater good. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Mongoose was a similar program. It was simply something that the U.S. deep state, military state planned to part of a full court press against Cuba, poison sugar exports and blow up schools in Cuba and disrupt the economy. Kennedy pulled the plug on that eventually too. Probably one reason he got killed. Gulf of Tonkin, much more important even, which was the time that the world got hosed in the pretend attack on the American USS Maxwell in the Gulf of Tonkin in the waters of Vietnam, North Vietnam. What exactly happened may remain partly unclear, but the U.S. naval ship was in North Vietnamese waters doing electronic espionage and also directing assassination teams in North Vietnam. So the North Vietnamese, with the equivalent of their little PT boat and a pea shooter, shoot at the U.S. vessel doing nothing. That's supposed to be unprovoked attack in international waters, which it wasn't international waters. And that was the justification for the massive buildup of the war in Vietnam, which is part of our history. Israel, just want to give a little shout out to the Israelis. They certainly engaged in some very, very pernicious false flags. They were able to do this, I think, because they were so closely allied to the United States. And so there's a number of them. The attack on the USS Liberty, you talk to some US Navy people about it to this day. They get very, very worked up over this. The ones that I want to point out is this is what it looks like, which is that there were bombings in the late 70s and 80s in France that look very, very much like some of the recent attacks in France today, if you ask me. One was a synagogue bombing in Paris in 1980, blamed on right-wing extremists. French intelligence looked into this. They never really got to the full answer of this, but they apparently came to the conclusion that it looked like it was Mossad, that is Israeli intelligence. Another probable Mossad bombing of a Jewish delicatessen in Paris, in 1982, blamed on right-wing extremists. 6 people died. Oh yes, Mossad connections of the assailant were deleted from the official report, but were discussed in foreign newspapers. And so it goes. When you think of Charlie Hebdo or the Paris massacre, a lot of these things we'll never get to the bottom of, but they look very, very suspicious to me. America continues to take the cake during the 60s, and these are all CIA-backed and organized coups, some of them really, really bad. This one the Cambodian one did lead directly to the Khmer Rouge, who of course murdered, 20% of their population in the 1970s. The CIA didn't put the Khmer Rouge in power, but what the CIA did is their actions directly led to these crazy people destroying their country. And there's the Afghani Mujahideen, who were, imagine you're running a country and your schools start blowing up and people start getting shot in the middle of the streets and hospitals get blown up and you're like, what is going on? And then you discover a foreign country is funding with a lot of money these well-armed militants, and you don't have the military or police to deal with them. Well, that happens a lot in the world these days. And it happened to Afghanistan in the 70s. Afghanistan back then was allied with the Soviet Union. This is all part of a plan by people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who said, we're going to bleed the Soviets dry, give them their own Vietnam. And it worked. Actually, it worked quite well. Gave these guys $1 billion worth of rocket launchers and weapons and said, go nuts. Sent them in many times from Saudi Arabia, including a young Osama bin Laden. And the Soviets came in to help out. That became the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the rest was history. They just, it was one of the factors that led to the demise of the Soviet Union. The U.S. thought that was awesome. The U.S. has had a long-standing love affair with Muslim jihadists. They wanted to fund the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in the 50s and 60s because they didn't like the government of Gamal Abdel Nasser back then. He was another Arab, pan-Arab secular leader. America was like, no, we don't like that. That didn't work, but the Mujahideen was a great success, and it would continue to be a success through the 1990s and 2000s, as we'll see. So as a result of all of these regime change things, the U.S. had Watergate, the U.S. had the Vietnam War, which didn't end up too well for the United States, as you may recall. And so it led to a kind of backlash. So the U.S. Congress investigated the horrors of the CIA, like, oh my God, they tried to poison Castro with toothpaste. Who knew? Things like this. It's so ridiculous now when you think that the United States used to pretend that their CIA never did anything like that. Like they were more pristine than imaginable. Well, obviously it's not true. And so a lot of this stuff comes out in the 70s. And so you have a backlash. And the reaction really among the U.S. national security state was to put a little bit of distance between what they needed to continue to do globally and tracing it back to them. So they came up with a really great idea. Let's use non-governmental organizations, NGOs, to create regime change. I'm going to show you a graph in a minute, which I would encourage you to take a picture of. In 1983 is when it all began. This is in the Reagan years now. They created the National Endowment for Democracy, known as the NED, to strengthen democratic institutions around the world through non-governmental efforts. Sounds lovely. Non-governmental sounds so wonderful. They're public. They don't have an agenda. Well, the NED from the start has been dominated by what we call neoconservatives. That is, anyone from Dick Cheney to Hillary Clinton or anyone in between. Neocons, that is empire builders who believe in the U.S. necessity to remake the world in its image. That's a neocon. They are a front for the CIA, that is the NED, totally funded by the U.S. government. The first president of the NED was a man named Alan Weinstein. He just said straight out, a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. Yes, that's right. So let's just move on. This is the NED, and it's the structure of how things work. So the NED is funded by the U.S. State Department, U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. That's the primary funding mechanism by the State Department for NGO activity globally. And it goes through here, and it is then funneled to various other, other organizations, Freedom House, National Institute, International Republican Institute, and these others. These are all international-based NGOs who then funnel to NGOs of the target nation, like Ukraine, which received like $5 billion of NGO money through the 90s and into the 2000s to help fund their, revolutions that they had in their country. In addition to the official money, you get unofficial money. So you get CIA money going directly into these various organizations. And you also get private groups like George Soros. Everyone knows about George Soros, or the Koch brothers, the Dolan Foundation, and so forth. And they will also give money to the NED or directly to these local NGOs. So there's a lot of different ways that these foreign NGOs will get their money. But what it's important to understand is that when you hear, right now, the nation of Hungary or Russia, they talk very openly about how the NGOs in their country are nothing more than Western regime change organizations. They're not kidding. It's true. This is precisely how the system works. So before that whole system got into high gear, it really didn't, the NGO system wasn't fully crystallize until our century. So in the late 1980s and 90s, you have this transition period where the US government was really first starting to use media and public relations firms to orchestrate its invasions, like, you know, with the invasion of Panama, there's Manuel Noriega. Anytime, if you're listed by Time magazine as a bad guy like this, you better watch out, because they did it to Noriega, they did it to Gaddafi, they did it to Saddam, they're doing it to Putin. It's like Time magazine will always do the work of the national security state for them. The Panama invasion was a really interesting one. U.S. Had a Delta team, Delta Force in Panama, posing as Panamanian Defense Forces, engaging in attacks on U.S. personnel. It was just a justification used by President Bush. Operation Just Cause, it was called. There's a, methinks she does protest too much. Anyway, they go in, and the point of the Panama invasion was a couple of reasons, but one was that control of the Panama Canal was set to revert fully to Panama on January 1st, 1990. And Noriega was no longer a reliable puppet. That was his basic problem. Everyone knew he dealt drugs, you know, especially this guy. And he pretended to be shocked that Noriega was a drug dealer. So anyway, they took him out, and he just died a year ago in prison. I don't know if anyone remembers this young lady. The incubator hoax. Yeah, this is a good one. So the lead up to the war against Iraq in 1990-91, we could spend the entire day talking about that one. I mean, but we just don't have the time. But one thing that's true is after Saddam completely got hosed and played like a pawn on the chessboard by George Herbert Walker Bush, and he did. So now he's in Kuwait, and basically his pants are down, and he's trying to think, how do I get out of this country? I've been tricked into invading it. He was tricked into invading it. This young lady speaks to the U.S. Congress. She was actually the daughter of Kuwait's ambassador to the U.S., although no one knew that. She was posing as a Kuwaiti nurse. And when the Iraqi troops came into Kuwait, she gives a teary-eyed presentation about how the horrible Iraqi troops came into a room where there were premature babies in these incubators, and they took the babies and threw them on the floor to die. And it wasn't true. There's no evidence for this whatsoever. But it was a great, great public relations victory. And the country, I remember listening to this on National Public Radio back when I thought NPR was actually a legitimate source of news. And I thought, oh my God, those horrible Iraqi troops, we have to do something about it. U.S. started hiring major PR firms to manage public opinion, starting around the Persian Gulf War. And it's just got better. Yugoslavia, I don't know how much time I have. How much time do I have for this lecture? I have like an hour? Good. 45 minutes. I'm going through fast here because I want to slow down and stop for some of the more meaty things. Yugoslav, some of you remember all of this. You know, it's hard to keep rewriting so much history because there's just too much. There's too much to rewrite in 90 minutes. Too much to correct in 90 minutes is really what I should be saying. But what we were being taught about Yugoslavia at the time was completely stage managed. The point of Yugoslavia essentially was a war by NATO against Yugoslavia. It was the last socialist country in Europe. Okay? After the fall of the Soviet Union, all those communist countries went away, but not Yugoslavia. They remained. They were a target. The western portion of Yugoslavia, including Croatia, were highly prized. And the desire by NATO and by the Western power elite was to bring them in to their system, just break them off of the rest of Yugoslavia. And so this is exactly what happened. News media were completely complicit in overplaying. I mean, it's not that one side was totally good and one side was bad, but to portray the Serbs as these evil expansionists creating a greater Serbia was not true and not accurate. And never, it was never intended to be accurate. It was only intended to be manipulative. So the real point of this, I think, justifying NATO's existence after the Cold War. After all, after the Soviet Union disbanded and the Warsaw Pact went away, that was their version of NATO, why would we need the European Why would we need the U.S. back NATO anymore? I mean, what's the point? Well, this is the point. They needed something to justify their existence. And I think even more importantly, to undermine a key feature of the United Nations Charter, which states a commitment to non-interference and territorial integrity. It was never appropriate for the United Nations simply to intervene in a country that had its own territorial integrity. And Yugoslavia was the moment at which that broke. And so it created a precedent, which, of course, most notoriously they did to Libya when they destroyed Libya a few years ago. I mean, completely destroyed Libya. So I think that's what it was about. Oh, also, yes, to test something new, hybrid warfare, disinformation, economic warfare, foreign proxy armies. A number, not all, but some of the Bosnian Muslims who were fighting in that war were actually fresh out of the fields of Afghanistan from the U.S. So they just continued right on. Then we have what are called the color revolutions. And this is where the NGO model starts to come into place fully. So I'll just talk about these a little bit. So what you have in the old Soviet Union, in Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan, are three revolutions almost right after each other within the space of 15, 16 months. Basically, it's one revolution that happens 3 times. See all the nice orange colors? That's Ukraine. That's the orange revolution. Georgia had a rose revolution, and Kyrgyzstan had a pink or tulip revolution. So it's all about branding. It becomes very important all of a sudden. All of these were spearheaded by the American NGOs that I was just talking about a few minutes ago, working for U.S. foreign policy. The whole point was to take out a government that was less friendly to U.S. interests and install a government that was more friendly to U.S. Basically, we're talking corporate interests, financial interests. So we'll just talk a little bit about Ukraine for a minute, just to get into some detail. So with the one that the U.S. wanted was named Yushchenko, and the NGOs, and we're talking millions of dollars, were used to bus crowds of people in, giving out all the balloons and all the banners and all the orange, giving out sleeping bags and heaters and toilets and soup kitchens, and most importantly, TV and radio coverage, really important. The whole thing was very well orchestrated. They had the money, they had the intelligence, they had the organizational strategy, and they basically go into this country and they created something out of whole cloth. And then the idea is, when you get a core of something happening, you do every bit your best to bring in as much of the public as you can to give it a genuine appearance of something real. But basically, the Orange Revolution was paid for by American cash, including George Soros and Freedom House. They were involved in this. Anyway, so here's how to throw out a government in 9 easy steps. First, you need a lot of money, like millions of dollars, billions or better. But, $100 million, let's say, if you just happen to have that in your spare change, that helps. And with that, you go into your target country, and you give a lot of money to your core leadership group. They, in turn, hire their people, their organizers, their foot soldiers, their ideologues, who will go around and do this. Those people will create the social media, the Facebook page, the YouTube accounts, their website, Twitter feed, all of that they create. So they get the electronic infrastructure up and running, as well as a physical infrastructure. Whether it's shanty towns or bandstands, speaker platforms, tents, food, outdoor toilets, whatever. And then the main thing you need is an event. You have to create an event that sparks a movement. So the event could be a protest that is violent enough that it sparks police response that you then must record and put on YouTube. It's very critically important. Or it could be that someone you identify as a political prisoner becomes your cause, or whatever it is. Or an election, maybe the most common way. An election that is coming up that you will automatically deem to be a fraudulent election before it even happens. This is very much the rule. So you do all of that, you create the event that sparks the movement, you create your propaganda around it. You must provoke police response to some extent, and that's essential for social media. Get the local politicians involved, and you've got to get the U.S. Once the United States government condemns repressive actions by a government, you know you're on your way to easy street, and you'll probably be running the country before long. So that happened in the color revolutions in Eastern Europe and around Russia. It almost but didn't happen in Iran in 2009. I'm going to talk a little bit about the failed Iranian green revolution. Here's another color. They called it the green revolution, of course. All important with that branding. So there were elections in Iran in June of 2009. And just before that election started, a number of Twitter accounts started up, like the day before, talking about, like the day of the election, before the voting was even like halfway done, the Twitter accounts were talking about how the government was repressing the vote and was instituting a coup d'etat against the people. Like, the vote wasn't even done, but they're out there getting it all starting up and talking about how the government was killing people in the streets. People are dying. We need international support. United States, help us. These Twitter bot accounts. In 2009, no one was really talking about Twitter bots like they do today. But this literally was the case here. It's, always true that whenever these suspicious accounts start, Western media always runs right to them and says, oh, my poor dears, you are obviously telling the truth, and let's promote your cause. And that happened in the United States. So US media and Western media in general immediately legitimized these claims, none of which, by the way, I don't know if you noticed the sign here, Ahmadinejad is not my president. Look familiar? Yeah, we just had this in the United States a couple of years ago, like a year and a half ago, not my president. I'll come back to that in a moment, because the color regime protocols, I believe, did run to some extent in the United States in the 2016 election. I'll come up to it. Anyway, a very good article on this failed Iranian revolution by a man named Bill Noxid called The Arab Spring Exposed. Highly recommend it. But basically a lot of what are called sock puppet accounts. So a sock puppet account is a fake account, fake YouTube or fake Twitter or fake. Sock puppets can also be in the comments below news articles by very suspicious people. These days, it's very popular in the US to blame all sock puppets on the Russians. That's funny, because actually the US is the master of sock puppets, and we know this. Again, just look through your Snowden revelations back in 2013. It was all out there exposed before anyone was talking about the Russians. The US Pentagon spends, I think it's $4 billion a year, US, on managing its social image, including the use of sock puppets. And that came out 5 years ago. No one's going to compete with the US on this. I mean, are you kidding me? Regime change, that's our job. Forget the Russians. They don't do the regime change. That's the US. They did succeed to a large extent in 2011 with the Arab Spring. Here's a map of the Middle East where some of these events happened. If you remember your history, it started with Tunisia in December 2010. The big countries that were, the whole thing just seemed to be spontaneous, right? I remember when the Arab Spring happened, and probably like many of you thinking, well, this is exciting, Arab people living for so long under what were clearly, repressive conditions, right? And suddenly wanting freedom. It was wonderful. And then you start hearing claims that the CIA had kind of jumped in and was trying to commandeer those events, and that is absolutely true. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it. So in the case of Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Bahrain, Egypt, others, this happened. They all had, each region had its specific branding, again, specific colors, specific images, slogans. Tunisia had jasmine, Egypt had the lotus, Lebanon had cedar, Libya had a traditional Libyan flag, pre-Gaddafi flag with a crescent tossed in there. And Syria had nearly the same flag that Libya had, actually. In the cases of Libya and Syria, the flags and banners came out to the streets literally factory fresh with creases, right, having just been manufactured, just brought right out. And in most of those places, nearly all of them actually, Egypt, Syria, Libya, the rebels were immediately armed and violent. Not the police. The rebels started the violence in most of these places. Just to talk a little bit about how it happened in Libya. Libya was the most tragic example of what happened in the Arab Spring. I don't know if you know this. It had been the wealthiest nation in Africa at the time of 2011. Gaddafi, who ran that country, and yes, he was a dictator, strongman, call him what you will, took it from the third poorest nation in Africa when he took it over in the late 60s and brought it to the wealthiest. Libya is blessed with lots of underground water, oil, gold. And if you were in Libya back in those times, if you were a woman, you could wear what you want. Free health care, free housing for the homeless, university for men and women. Not the worst place to live, Libya. Not by any means. In fact, I would suggest they probably had more local democracy than the United States has. Yes, they had a guy at the top who ran it all, but on the local level, Libyans actually had a lot of control over their lives, and it was a good place to live. Well, it's destroyed now. But the point was they demonized Gaddafi, who, like Nasser, like Saddam Hussein, was basically a pan-Arabist. Gaddafi particularly was quite brave, and he believed in Arab unity. And he wasn't into, Muslim Sharia law. He wasn't a jihadist. He was a secular leader. Not the worst thing, for the Arab world, frankly. The problem with Libya is that it was independent of Western financial control, largely independent anyway, including the International Monetary Fund and including the major banks. Gaddafi was a threat to the petrodollar system, which I'll come back to in a moment. But basically, he was a threat to the U.S. US-dominated financial system, and was going to appears to have about to institute a gold-backed version of their own currency. That would have been a real problem. WikiLeaks, thankfully, released a memo that was directed to Hillary Clinton, who at the time was U.S. Secretary of State, called France and Gaddafi's Gold. And it really lays out, better than any official explanation you'll ever get, the real reasons for the invasion of Libya. France was involved in getting a piece of the action, but it was all concerned about Gaddafi rolling out a gold-backed currency. The U.S. flew this guy in. His name was Khalifa Hifter. He'd been living just outside of the CIA. He was like in Georgetown or in Virginia for 20 years. When the Arab Spring breaks out, they flew him out to Benghazi in Libya and said, "This is the leader of the Libyan revolution." Like, okay, great. So he comes out there. And again, in Libya, you get phony Twitter accounts, YouTube, all the sock puppets come out, all in English. All or many created one day before the protests started, with registration, at least for one of them, in Ohio. Can you be any more obvious? And just like what happened in Iran 2 years earlier, but now in Libya, all of these anonymous claims, we're being carpet bombed by Gaddafi, and all of these others, completely blindly accepted as true, none of which have, to this day, a shred of evidence to support them. So just shows how it works out. Syria, same thing. So the U.S. figured it could do the same thing in Syria that it did to Libya. Because they did take out Libya, and they turned it into a failed state. And you think, well, why would they want to do that? But they prevented Libya from breaking the U.S. system, so it was a success. Of course, it sparked the migrant crisis, which has been haunting Europe to this day. But, well, again, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. And maybe there's an upside to that, too, from the point of view of those elites. I'm just going to leave it at that. But with Syria, they thought they could do the same thing. You have the same, it's almost a reset of what happened in Libya, almost the exact same thing starting at the same time. Armed uprising by U.S.-backed jihadists. Why do we know they're U.S.-backed? I'll tell you why. The chemical weapons attacks, which were blamed on the Syrian government. Evidence-free assertions. The United Nations looked into one of the key ones in Ghouta a couple of years ago and said, no, it doesn't look like the Syrian government did this at all. This is most probably the work of the jihadist rebels. It's hard to know with precision, but when these things happen, the U.S. immediately blames the government they don't like. This is a memo from 2006 by the U.S. ambassador to Syria. So it's 5 years before the Arab Spring broke out. Thanks to WikiLeaks, we have access to this, and I'm going to explain it to you. It's by the U.S. ambassador named William Roebuck at the time. Imagine being the ambassador to a country and you're issuing memos on how to overthrow the government that's hosting you. Well, there's an old joke, by the way. Why has there never been a regime change in the United States? Answer, because they don't have a U.S. ambassador in the country. So that's, so Roebuck in 2006 writes a memo on how to create paranoia in the Syrian government, how to make it overreact to Islamic extremists, how to create sectarian strife by Shiite and Sunni, by creating and spreading fake rumors. By the way, all of these things had been planned and were enacted by the United States against Iraq just a few years earlier. In fact, at the same time, in 04, 05, and 06, the U.S. ambassador in Iraq was a man named John Negroponte doing the exact same business that Roebuck was planning here in Syria. They were much more successful in Iraq. Point was they want to control Syrian energy resources, control Syrian territory. It's all about natural gas, a lot of it. I'll have to skip some of these details. But one of the things that they had always planned to do is smuggle in weapons over the border. By the way, one of the untold stories of Benghazi, I'm sure you've heard about Benghazi. This is a huge thing in the United States. The U.S. ambassador to Libya was murdered, was killed in on September 11th, 2012. His name was Christopher Stevens. And, you know, for years, the Republicans in the U.S. Congress were really blaming this on Hillary Clinton and the failure of the State Department to protect their ambassador. But there's a backstory to Benghazi that you never hear. That's way more interesting, to be honest with you. What Stevens was a regime change specialist. And that's why he came to Libya in the first place, and that's why he was rewarded with the ambassadorship after Gaddafi was murdered. So what was happening after that happened? Well, they were running weapons from the old Libyan army to Turkey over the northern Syria border and giving them to jihadists to destabilize the Syrian government. So the whole gun-running operation was going on. You never hear anyone talking about that in the U.S. Congress. God forbid someone implicate the CIA in something like that. So who killed Christopher Stevens? I don't know, but it wouldn't shock me if it was some Gaddafi loyalist, someone who was angry over the fact that their country was destroyed by the United States and now they were smuggling weapons out. Just a thought. We may never know the full story. But the Benghazi story is really, in my view, about covert weapons smuggling by the U.S. Am I running out of time?
No, you've got 20 minutes.
All right, good.
And there's some water if you need it.
Thank you. So I'm going to skip past some of this stuff and move on to domestic false flags like 9/11 and others. Oh yeah, the gay girl in Damascus, another false flag. This is a U.S. op, a supposedly Syrian-American girl who was, you know, promoter of the freedom. She was supposedly kidnapped, and it was a big thing. Probably everyone's forgotten all about it. But it was a big thing at the time. That was a U.S. intelligence hoax. Basically a sock puppet. They got the white helmets in Syria now. Same thing as before. The U.S. did the same thing to Brazil in 2016. Basically a soft Wall Street coup. The scandal that happened in Brazil against Dilma Rousseff a couple of years ago was almost certainly orchestrated by the NSA, which had access to information and basically whipped up public opinion. A lot of U.S. money went into this, and also wealthy Brazilian money went into that. The U.S., this was supposed to be the result. That's Newsweek with their, oops, sorry, we thought we had it right, Madam President. Didn't happen. The signs come out, not my president. Yeah, in 25 American cities, like overnight, with precision, you got the exact same types of protests breaking out. Same slogans. I mean, the whole thing was very, very orchestrated. Despite the shock, no one expected Donald Trump to win. And then he does. He wins. After a year and a half of basically being portrayed as Hitler 2.0, he wins. Really, he was portrayed. Of course, he helped himself along the way, sounding like a 12-year-old. I will certainly grant you that. But the demonization campaign was quite obvious, quite obvious. By the way, I have many, many critiques of Trump's foreign policy and a lot of his domestics as well. But to turn him into Hitler 2.0, no, sorry, not quite. Not quite right. But I guess my point about this is that within the U.S., the money, the interests that have promoted a kind of social polarization that has occurred in the United States, and it has occurred in the United States. This is an agenda, in my view. I think a lot of us are still trying to get to the bottom of it, but it absolutely looks like an operation, very much along the same lines as the U.S. orchestrated color revolutions and regime change of many, many, many times in the past. And I simply think the same pattern has been worked in the United States, and it still hasn't played itself out. It's still going. So into the 21st century, our time, there's two fundamental reasons why false flags are necessary today, in my opinion. Necessary from the point of view of those people who see themselves as our betters, I should say. So one is globalization. This is Seattle, Washington, United States in 1999. If you remember your history from 20 years ago, there were major protests in that city as a result of the World Trade Organization having a convention there. Seattle residents organized, over 40,000, probably more, shut the city down. Tear gas didn't work, pepper spray didn't work. They inhibited, they didn't prevent, but they certainly inhibited the WTO from convening. And I don't know this, but I will say that I think those people at the very top said, no, that's not going to happen ever again. Back then, that's when people thought they had rights. And so things had to happen to change the mindset of people from preventing this kind of protest from happening ever again. I mean, after all, what were they complaining about? They're complaining about economic disruption and loss of jobs. And the one thing I'm going to say about candidate Trump from 2016 is that at least part of his platform sounded pretty identical to that of Ralph Nader from 20 years earlier, if you know American politics. Nader said the exact same thing at this time, the loss of jobs. He just did it from the left. Trump did it from the right. Same exact critique. The other reason for false flags today is because of this thing, the U.S. petrodollar. That's Henry Kissinger. That's the king of Saudi Arabia. Long story short, the U.S. dropped the gold standard in 1971. They instituted the petrodollar standard 2 years later. Basically what that meant is they got all the Arab nations to sell their oil only accepting gold. It was great for the U.S., wonderful for the U.S., basically holding the world hostage. The U.S. did a couple of nice things for the Saudis in return, like fund them, their military, and give them all kinds of weapons. But the point is that it forces oil exporting nations to export their oil accepting only dollars. Now that system is disintegrating slowly over time, and we're seeing the slow death of the petrodollar system. But it's not dead yet, and the U.S. is hanging on. When Saddam was invaded in 2003, the real reason is that he had been selling his oil in euros starting in 2000. And as I mentioned, Gaddafi, he had to come down because he was damaging the petrodollar system. So if you fight that system, this is what happens. Time magazine comes to get you. So let's talk about entering our strange era. I'm going to talk first a little bit about Oklahoma City, 1995. This is a bombing in Moscow in 1999. That was probably a false flag, too. 1990 saw a sort of build up to the false flag era that we live in now. Oklahoma City, I'll just talk a little bit about that. There is no way on earth, if you look at the science and the mechanics of what happened to the Murrah building in Oklahoma City in 1995, that was caused by a nitrogen fertilizer, ammonium nitrate and fuel oil bomb from the back of a truck 40 feet away from the building that did that damage. There's been detailed forensic analysis of the steel beams in that building that absolutely prove the impossibility of a little truck bomb down here causing all of this damage up here. Absolutely. There were initial reports of 2 explosions, by the way, including seismic data proving that. The bomb itself that was supposedly used is very difficult to make it work, and it could not have created the damage done to the building. The building was demolished almost immediately, so there was no forensic analysis that was possible to do on it. There's much, much more. Russia, in 1999, Boris Yeltsin was in his last legs of being the leader of that country, and there were the problem of Chechen separatists, probably some of whom were definitely funded by Western CIA interests. But in this case, it looks like this bombing, there's a very good case to be made that Russian intelligence, the FSB, knew about this in advance and let this happen. It was instrumental in bringing Vladimir Putin to power. We come to 9/11 in 2001. And you know, there are experts on 9/11 vastly, vastly more proficient than I could be in describing some of the impossibilities of this. But this is the World Trade Center. I'm a New Yorker. I spent time at the World Trade Center building. It was very wonderful. My dad worked there. He was a fire safety director who had Tuesdays off at the time. So he survived. The man he shared his job with, unfortunately, was killed that day. 9/11 was personal to a lot of Americans, a lot of people in the world. But that doesn't mean that's why it's a false flag, just because it's emotionally powerful to us. We have to look at the facts. So odd things, many odd things about this, which it wasn't my intention to go into the details. So if you're expecting that, I'm sorry. I don't mean to disappoint you. But my intention on false flags is to explain to you why they're an important part of our world, not to go into the detailed forensic analysis. There's enough of that on YouTube, enough of that on the web. You can just read it. The fact is that just a couple of weeks ago in Uluru, Tracy and I met with one of the members of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, a lady who's one of the world's top experts on the collapse of Building 7 and has done a great deal of work on that. I think it's a very, very strong case. Nothing hit Building 7, and yet, several hours later, it comes down at free fall speed in a big pile of dust. 9/11, there's so many other things. If you look at, there's Shanksville. It's like, where's the plane? And why was debris found 8 miles away? There's just nothing. When planes hit the ground, they don't sink into the dirt. There's debris. This is a representation. This is out there on the web. It's been out for years, of the Pentagon. The Pentagon attack is, to me, a particularly interesting one, if you really know the details of it. So that plane was hijacked about 45 minutes into the flight, we're told, about 500 miles away, 30,000 feet, 25, 30,000 feet. They're above the clouds. And there are 4 hijackers on that plane, led by a man named Hani Hanjour, who, soaking wet, was something like 140 pounds, 5'7", not a big guy, but he's got his box cutter knife, and somehow fights his way to the cockpit, takes out the 2 pilots, one of whom was a former F-4 fighter jock who was about 6'3". Looked like he could handle himself to me, but somehow Hani Hanjour takes him out of the cockpit, takes over the controls of the plane. No one hits the emergency button, which was right there in front of them, so the plane is just taken over by this pilot, who a week before had flunked a test to fly a Cessna aircraft, but now he's got a huge Boeing 737 flying the wrong way above the clouds. He's got to turn this thing around and guide it back with precision, better than Christopher Columbus at the Art of Dead Reckoning, to his target, which he then does. In a maneuver, I've spoken to 3 commercial pilots about this maneuver. Every one of them said they could not have done what he did. So whatever it was that comes back into D.C., as the whole country is going cuckoo over 9/11, air defense, you'd think, is on highest alert. This aircraft's coming in, right? The air traffic controllers watch the maneuver that he makes, and it's such an amazing maneuver. They're like, oh, it has to be one of our jet interceptors. Thank God, where have you guys been? No, it's this big, fat Boeing 737, supposedly, doing a corkscrew spiral toward the Pentagon, hits it from the back end, coming in a mile away at an altitude of something like 20-plus feet for a mile, which is actually an impossibility. There's an effect known as wind sheeting, which that type of aircraft is either going to go up or down. It's not going to go flat, straight at 400 miles per hour at an altitude of 20 feet. You can't do it. But something did, because it sheared off the street lights. So, and then punctures bullet-like 6 reinforced walls, 3 rings of the Pentagon. So that in one photograph shows the final puncture, which is a perfect circle, about 7, 8 feet in diameter. So what did that? This is essentially, this is a hollow tube here. This doesn't have depleted uranium to punch through like a bullet. So there are many, and by the way, the fire marshal who arrived on the scene, his initial response was, I don't see a plane, I don't see bodies, I don't see anything here. A couple of days later, one intrepid, smart journalist caught that and found him, and he said, oh, no, it was all there. Well, okay. But it wasn't there. There's so much more about this. So the point was 9/11 had to happen. Why did it have to happen? Well, it had to happen to pass the USA Patriot Act, for one, to institute a domestic revolution. But 9/11 by itself may not have been enough. That's why the Anthrax attack, I just want to talk a little bit about that, was so important. The Anthrax was the 2 in the 1-2 punch that gave the Americans the Homeland Security State, the USA Patriot Act. If you remember back then, if 9/11 had been a one-off, it is quite possible that it would not have been quite enough to traumatize the Americans into the next 2 decades of craziness that they've been involved in. Anthrax was necessary. Anthrax meant, first it's 9/11. Now it's biological weapons. You never know what's going to happen next, America. And one of the letters that came out with the anthrax was this one, referring directly to 9/11 and saying, take your penicillin, death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great. So pretty much laying it out in the lap of the Muslims. Except we know that they didn't do it. Why do we know this? Well, because the FBI did their own analysis. The whole thing was traced to the Ames strain of anthrax, highly weaponized U.S. military-grade weapons anthrax. All right? This was not Osama bin Laden. This was not Saddam Hussein, despite the fact that George Bush and Dick Cheney and Condoleezza Rice and John McCain and Rumsfeld all, at one point or another, pointed to those people, or just Muslim terrorists in general. No, it was traced to a U.S. lab. And then they tried to pin it on one U.S. scientist. That didn't work. He countersued and won millions of dollars. And then they tried to pin it on another U.S. scientist who couldn't defend himself eventually because he committed suicide. And so he's the guy who did it, supposedly. All I want to ask is this. Who wrote this letter? Who wrote this letter? Allah is great. Clearly, this was an operation. And by the way, during the whole time that the anthrax scare was front row center of the U.S. media machine, the U.S. Congress was passing the USA Patriot Act. The day that the Patriot Act passed, which was October 24th, 2001, the following day or day and a half later, we learn, oh yes, that anthrax, apparently it didn't come from Muslims after all. No, the FBI knew this all along. So the whole thing was a game played on us to shock the Americans into handing away all their rights, because that's what the Patriot Act did. Much more to say, but I'm going to go through this and give you. There's a lot of what happened after 9/11 was that a lot of other countries jumped onto the bandwagon, partly to get U.S. money from their war on terror, and in part the U.S. themselves did it to get other nations on board as well. So it's part of the world we live in, and I would go on more, but I'm giving myself, I don't have a lot of time. I do want to give us a little bit of a profile of false flags. A couple of things to keep in mind. Important, it's not always necessary that location is a factor, but it can be. New York City World Trade Center, Paris shooting, just before the G20 summit, where it's going to get a lot of media attention. It's really important. And you want to look at timing. You want to look for important meetings or conferences at the same time. Like the last so-called chemical weapons attack in Syria was just before Syria was bringing in chemical weapons inspectors, like one day before, and then there's a chemical weapons attack by the government. Are you kidding me? No, of course not. So you want to look for timing. You want to look for trauma, mass killings, threats, often symbolic. In the case of 9/11, perfect example. What was actually damaged? Well, the symbol of American financial power, the World Trade Center. The symbol of American military power, the Pentagon. What was actually damaged? Not really a lot. I mean, yes, people were killed. It was horrible. But in terms of actual ability to damage the United States' strength and power, insubstantial. It's easy to forget this because we were overwhelmed with trauma and death and symbolism. All right? But these things are symbolic. What you want to look for are initially competing narratives. So like the first day, particularly from local sources, you want to look and see what information is coming out. All right. It's harder and harder now because it's hard to know what's true anymore, right? But you still need to look for this, particularly local sources of news. This is San Bernardino, one of the shootings in the U.S., and the story had come out. Supposedly it was by a Muslim couple, man and woman. You had reports that it was 3 big white guys with guns doing the shooting. You often have reports of these shootings of multiple gunmen. This happened in Aurora, Colorado, with the James Holmes shooting, which took place there. It happened in Las Vegas just recently, of course, if you've been following that one. That's a very, very interesting one indeed. a lot of deeply suspicious elements about the Vegas shooting. Or, you know, other accounts like planes were shot down like at 9/11 and so forth. You want to know, cases closed immediately. These are the brothers in the Boston bombing marathon, the Sarnaev brothers, Tamerlan and Zokar. I did a very long episode on the Boston Marathon bombing from the Gaia TV show, and it did not air. So unfortunately, I was very happy with it, actually. It was 30 minutes. But essentially, you find those two kids were set up, in my opinion, absolutely set up. But in all of these cases, it's a cliche. The patsy's killed off. And if he's alive, he's convicted in a secret kangaroo court, like this young man. And he was of course, killed off by the police. And, you know, the media is totally unified in giving a single opinion. Then you get the slogans. Oh, my goodness, like as if they came out of a Madison Avenue boardroom. As if. Je suis Charlie. Or these colors don't run. Or Boston strong. And on and on. It's all to create emotional buy-in. Or the branding, the colors, the slogans. All of these are important because to do a false flag, you're basically wedding the emotional part of your thinking to the intellectual part of your thinking. This is why people don't like to argue about religion and politics, because we're emotionally tied into these things. And the people doing these events know this full well. They know just how to manipulate you. So they'll create the slogans, they'll create the brand so that you connect emotionally, you tie in emotionally to these things. Sociologically convenient scapegoats. In the 90s, it was white supremacists, then it became Muslims. Sometimes it's gun owners in the United States. Sometimes it's conspiracy theorists, like the LAX shooting was a conspiracy theorist, and on and on. So, and then you get the media comes on. It's always like very predictable. Something horrible happens in the United States, but also, I'm sure, here, and the media will start having the debates. Well, we need security, but we do want to protect our rights, don't we? Yes, we do. And they'll go back and forth. The narrative is only there. Of course you need your rights. That's the whole point of a free society. But those are being questioned by your need for security. It's all about being secure. You have to be safe. And I have a lot more to say about this in the follow-up lecture to this. So you have this whole narrative to erode your rights. Corporate media will promote solutions to prevent future atrocities, keeping you safe, and on and on and on. Problem, solution. There's the Homeland Security, USA Patriot Act. Protect the homeland. By the way, when I was growing up in the United States, no one ever talked about the homeland. My God, that's something that you hear about from fascist and totalitarian societies. And suddenly, after 2001, we talk about the homeland. A little creepy. No one talks about it in my country. I don't understand this. What's happened? Government takes action. And, oh yeah, and then, of course, with really any false flag, there's millions of unanswered questions. And this is really where the rubber meets the road. Like, why was this guy's passport found in the ground after 9/11? Or why were passports of was it the Paris shooting? They found the guy's passport as well. And why did Building 7 collapse as well? Who wrote the Anthrax letters? On and on and on and on. So, and then all the blackout of information. It's gotten worse trying to get information on these things. Multiple drills. This is an important one. I'm almost done. 9/11 had multiple drills exactly detailing what happened. In other words, the day of 9/11, the U.S. had a drill that was Northern Vigilance, I believe it was called, to be an air defense against alleged hijackers of American airlines against American civilian targets. Oh, just by coincidence. Yeah. And you get a lot of these with the shootings, too. The Aurora shooting had a drill going on. The 7/7 bombings in London, the tube bombings, had drills going on. San Bernardino, drills. Parachuting, drills. Why? Why? Two reasons why, I would say. One is to create confusion in the response, so that the attack can go along as planned. But also, I think, as cover for planning in the attacks. So look, if you're in the intelligence community and you're planning this out, and someone suspects you of having done this, like someone else in the intelligence community. Let's say I've got a buddy in the intel community and he suspects my group of having planned it. I can just say, we didn't do it. We were just doing a drill. And it just so happened by coincidence that the real thing actually happened. We had nothing to do with the actual event. So I think it's for deniability within the command structure. What you find with a lot of these shooters and terrorists, they have their own connection going for years to intelligence groups. And all of these, some of these are shooters. That's the Norwegian shooter, and this is Tamerlan Tsarnaev, and many of the others. That's this is one of the hijackers. Thank you, yes, Osama. They all have their own connections to intel operatives. Too much to go into here. And who benefits? There's always someone who benefits. Like we had an underwear bomber in my country, if you remember, a guy with a bomb in his underwear. That's just like a joke that you don't even want to make anything of. But as a result of his supposed terrorist act, Michael Chertoff makes more millions of dollars with the full body scanners, and on and on and on. So last thing I'll just say is false flags are evolving, ever evolving. It's not always a military operation now. It could be a health scare. It could be pharmaceutical arranged. It could be corporate. I think Sony, North Korea, in conjunction with the CIA, they were involved in the alleged hack of their system. Or the Panama Papers that came out, or the Petrobras scandal in Brazil that took down Dilma Rousseff, investigative leaks. So in other words, this is a much more sophisticated type of operation than just, taking German troops and putting them in Polish uniforms and pretending that there's an attack. There's much more sophistication going on. And don't expect most false flags to be as big as 9/11. That was probably a once-in-a-lifetime level. Maybe there'll be another one on that scale, and that's the scary thought. But most false flags don't need to be that big. They're specific weapons targeted for specific types of laws. Like in the case of the Boston Marathon, simply as an example, the rollout of 19,000 militarized police in the United States for the first time, basically just to show Americans this is a new thing now. We have militarized police, in case you didn't know, and on and on. Or in aftermath of Sandy Hook, which is the one terrifying false flag no one ever wants to talk about, including myself. But the one thing I'll say about that, as a result of that, whether it was a genuine false flag or some other type of event that I don't know, was the upshot, which is to institute psychological profiling of the population for mental health screening. So all of these things come out in the aftermath of these events, whether they're shock doctrine types of events or false flag events. So they're becoming more and more sophisticated. Some of the stuff I'm going to talk about in my next lecture. Essentially, the mainstream media's increasingly total blanketing of information that is available to people. Essentially, what we're living in is a very complex propaganda and mind control system. There's one of my heroes, hopefully one of yours, Thomas Jefferson, who always says eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. It's really true. We have to stay awake. We're individual citizens of the world, and individually our resources are not as strong, but we can work together. We have to work together. Otherwise, it's hopeless. But we can do it. The reason false flags happen is because governments are afraid of the people. See, they have to do this as a way of corralling us, as a way of manipulating us. And so that by itself is proof that they feel it is necessary to try to trick us and fool us. So that shows that there's fear on their side. And that's something that we should never forget on our side. That's the end of this lecture. I'll thank you for your time, and we'll be back after a break. Thanks.